When I finished college, I think, like many people in their early 20s, I felt out of sorts, directionless, confused, and maybe a little scared. I was studying at Brown University, so the next natural step was to stay in New England, or at the very least, remain on the East Coast. So how on earth did I end up in Toledo, Ohio? Stay tuned to find out. For the first 7 weeks of our show, you heard the story of Samuel Chang, one of our founders, and how his journey led him first to Toledo, then the East Coast, and then to Toledo again. Now you'll be hearing from some other members of the Midstory team. We'll be sharing our histories, what brought us to Toledo, and what we've found in the Glass City. I'm Yafa Siegel, a fellow at Midstory, and I'll be your host today. I was born and raised in New York, near Lake Erie and miles away from Manhattan. I had a New York driver's license and voter registration, but save for that, there was a notable disconnect between my experience of New York State and New York City. Yet, there was this consuming pressure that moving to the city was the only thing worth doing. And maybe I would, eventually, but I believed that there had to be opportunity elsewhere. And frankly, New York didn't speak to me all that much. So, when deciding where to go after graduation, I stared through the fog of my peers, flocking to Brooklyn, Boston, and San Francisco. Much to the confusion of my friends and family, I found myself considering Ohio. Upstate New York has a lot more in common with the Midwest than many give it credit for. And it is safely a Great Lakes state, right? Funnily enough, I was drawn to the Midwest because of the people I met at school. Some of my favorite people, my closest friends, were from Ohio and Illinois. They were some of the most creative and persistent people I'd ever met, and more than that, they were kind and steady. I had applied to jobs all over, but when I got my fellowship offer from Midstory, it felt a bit like fate. It occurred to me that I had not spent a lot of time away from the East Coast, nor had anyone in my immediate family. And I'm not saying that everyone from New York is impatient or unkind, but as I watched more and more of my classmates find their footing in finance in grad school, I wondered if the stereotype of Midwest charm might have some weight to it, and I wanted to find out for myself. My curiosity and 20-something aimlessness brought me to Midstory, and in my few months as a fellow living and working in the Midwest, I have had the opportunity to make new friends and explore this vast region, especially Ohio, immersing myself in the history and culture of the heartland. And who else gets to say that they studied abroad in Toledo? Welcome to the Midstory Hour, a show produced by Midstory in collaboration with WGTE. This week, we're featuring stories about safe havens and open spaces, whether that be refuge from conflict, reinventing the old for a new place to call home, a field for frolicking, or a comfy space for curling up with a good book. Here at Midstory, we believe in the power of storytelling, especially about the places we call home. We've covered thousands of stories from across all 12 Midwest states, and each week on the Midstory Hour, we will share a few with you. Tune in every Saturday from 10 to 11 a.m. to learn something new about the place you call home, and likewise learn something new about places you've never been. This week, listen to the 4th episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy, a podcast produced by Reckoning Radio in collaboration with Ohio Humanities. The Copperhead Conspiracy tells a little-known story from the Civil War about a treasonous Midwestern plot to bring down the Union. This episode takes us even further north, to Canada. Then we'll visit Kings Mills in Cincinnati, where a group of real estate developers transformed an abandoned ammunition factory, once thought to be haunted, into a blossoming residential space. After that, we'll mosey over to Swanton, Ohio, where a flock of 35 bison roam and graze thanks to the efforts of 2 farmers redefining what bison conservation looks like in the 21st century. And last but not least, discover the Book Loft in Columbus, a Bavarian-themed bookstore in the heart of the German village. If you enjoy this program, be sure to listen to other episodes and check us out at midstory.org or on our socials. The land of the maple leaf has a reputation for being friendly. But this reputation goes beyond just being exceedingly polite. Especially during the American antebellum era, Canada served as a crucial endpoint on the Underground Railroad, providing safe haven for freedom seekers. So it might come as a surprise to find out that during the Civil War, there were some Canadians who held sympathies with the Confederacy and may have even spied against the North. Here is O Canada, the fourth episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy, an Ohio Humanities and Reckoning Incorporated podcast.
When President Lincoln kicked Copperhead leader Clement Vallandigham out of the Union in June 1863, he had troops escort him to Tennessee. From there, Vallandigham made his way to Wilmington, North Carolina. He then began a sea voyage that eventually took him to Halifax, Nova Scotia, by way of Bermuda, the traditional manner that Confederates used to evade the Union blockade and get to Canada. Once he got to Canada, he was treated exceedingly well.
He comes to Canada, and of course, he is feted as a hero.
Julian Schur is a journalist and the author of The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln.
There he'll meet John A. Macdonald, who is Canada's George Washington, the father of Confederation, and Macdonald toasts Vallandigham as a refugee in distress. He's invited as a guest to Parliament, and Vallandigham makes his way to Clifton House, beautiful, sumptuous hotel overlooking Niagara Falls. According to press reports that I uncovered, they would imbibe freely of Canadian whiskey and talk about hanging the abolitionists. And the newspapers were largely in favor of the Confederates, and they praised Vallandigham for his honest advocacy of peace. And they denounced Lincoln as, quote, the mad, blood-stained despot at Washington. And with the kind of gall that only someone on a crusade could really muster, what does he do? He decides to run as governor of Ohio from Canada.
The disgraced former U.S. congressman, exiled from the United States for treasonous speech during a time of war, received the Democratic Party's nomination for governor of Ohio, which by the fall of 1863 had become a hotbed of violent dissent against the U.S. government. Though he lost that election, he quickly pivoted toward a new goal, becoming the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. This is the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Gediman. At the beginning of the American Civil War, Canada was still a colony in the British Empire, and both the United States and the Confederacy very much wanted Britain as an ally.
Well, when the Civil War breaks out, I think Abraham Lincoln and many people in the North hoped Britain would be on their side. After all, Britain had led the world in abolishing slavery. And I think much to their dismay and shock, Britain declares neutrality, which meant automatically that Canada, which was still a colony of Britain, was also neutral. What it meant for Canada, though, is that Canada became a very open legal haven for Confederates. This wasn't secret or hidden. It meant that the Confederates, they could send agents, and rich aristocrats could live in Montreal and Toronto, send back supplies to the South, but also campaign openly for the Southern cause. So I think Jefferson Davis and Lincoln both saw Canada in the same way. But one was very happy. Davis was very happy that Canada was supporting the South. And of course, Lincoln grew increasingly enraged.
All of this begs the question of why Canadians would be so supportive of the South during the Civil War, especially given Canada's reputation as a promised land for those enslaved in the United States.
There were all kinds of reasons why there was a surprising amount of support for the South among the Canadian elites, not among the general population. We know there were no popular opinion polls, but we know that tens of thousands of ordinary Canadians signed up and fought in the Union Army. Many die, some become generals and receive all kinds of medals. But among the Canadian elites, there were several reasons why I don't think they necessarily supported slavery, but they had a sympathy for the aristocratic South. There was a class affinity. Canada, had these British aristocrats, and the Southerners who came up here and established homes were of the same class, the same high bearing, and they bought fancy mansions and went to the same clubs. So you have that class unity, the fellow aristocrats. Second, you had economic reasons. Much like today, oligarchs from Russia have set up themselves in London, and there's a huge market for getting around the sanctions against Russia. Well, during the Civil War, because of the blockade, you could make a fortune from Canada sending all kinds of goods around the blockade to the Confederates, not to mention the Navy shipyards in Halifax. Confederate companies were being traded on the London Stock Exchange. 80% of Britain's cotton came from the South. So there were a bunch of economic reasons to support the South. And also a lot of the conservative church leaders, the Catholic Church in Quebec. And it's quite appalling because as a Canadian, I grew up, being happy and proud, learning in school that Canada was on the right side of the Civil War, right? The terminus for the Underground Railroad. And when I discovered that leading newspapers praised the assassination of Lincoln, like when Lincoln gets assassinated, Canadian newspapers said it was justified by the facts because Lincoln had murdered the Constitution. So you can see why Canada was such a friendly haven for the Confederates.
So all of this helps to explain why Canada would be considered the logical destination for a growing community of exiled Copperheads, escaped Confederate soldiers, and official representatives of the Confederate government, sent north to begin secret operations against the United States.
In early 1864, the tide is beginning to turn against the Confederates. They're not quite losing yet, but they're not winning anymore. And so Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States, gets the Confederate politicians to secretly vote for a $1 million secret fund to set up what are called the Confederate Secret Services. Most of that money would go to Canada. And Davis named a good friend of his, a man named Jacob Thompson, who was a well-known politician in Washington, knew a lot of people in Lincoln's cabinet, a staunch Southerner, a Mississippi slave owner. He is sent to Canada, first arrives in Halifax, and will eventually settle in Toronto. But first he will come to Montreal, and he will deposit close to $649,000, which is the equivalent today of $12 million, in a branch of the Ontario Bank run by Henry Starnes. Henry Starnes had been the mayor of Montreal for 2 years. He was a sitting member of Parliament, one of the leading English aristocrats, and his bank would become the main money laundering and slush fund operation for Jacob Thompson. And his number two would be Clement Clay. Clement Clay is actually the man who's on the back of the Confederate $1 bill. So Clement Clay will move to St. Catharines, just north of the American border. And from there, he would disperse funds for the various terror plots that the Confederates engaged in.
While Jacob Thompson was in Montreal, he had a series of meetings with people from both the South and the North, learning the lay of the land and figuring out the best ways to invest the $1 million that he'd been given to use. He summarized his activities in a letter to Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell, who were representing the Confederacy in Britain and France.
Gentlemen, the result of the conferences we held at Montreal led me to conclude that Lincoln would be reelected overwhelmingly, and thus there would be continued the present policy of the administration for 4 years more. In discouragement, I went to Windsor, Ontario, where an arrangement had been made with the Honorable Clement Vallandigham. He informed me of the existence in the Western states of an order known as the Sons of Liberty. The membership of the Sons of Liberty is in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, in the aggregate about 170,000 men. It is proposed by the Northwestern people to take possession of the present organized governments of the 3 states mentioned and organize provisional governments for the purposes in view. It can be, I confidently feel, so arranged that these states shall be organized into a Northwestern Confederacy, with such advantages as will enable them to dictate terms of peace to the United States government. To this end, I am addressing every energy that is practicable and reasonable to assist the Northwestern people, and everything justifies the belief that success will ultimately attend the undertaking. I remain, with great respect, very truly yours, Jacob Thompson.
As we learned in our last episode, the Copperhead uprising discussed by Jacob Thompson and Clement Vallandigham in Ontario would eventually be attempted in late August 1864. But it was originally supposed to happen earlier that year, in mid-June, to coincide with the State Democratic Convention in Hamilton County, Ohio. And it was going to be triggered by a surprise appearance by the exiled Vallandigham, who had represented that district in Congress for 3 terms. The idea was that the Union Army would immediately arrest him for returning to the United States, and that this would so enrage Copperheads throughout the country that they would spontaneously rise up in armed rebellion. And that would then provide cover for the Confederates to spring their soldiers out of Union prisons. But Lincoln wisely decided that this time Vallandigham should not be arrested, precisely so that he would not be seen as a martyr for the Copperhead cause. Once it became clear that he wasn't going to be arrested, the Confederates and their Copperhead allies looked for another opportunity to pull the trigger on their plan. Coordinating all this were Captain Thomas Hines and his second-in-command, Captain John B. Castleman. Castleman wrote about his experiences in a memoir called Active Service. In his telling, it became clear to him, and to Hines, that rather than trying to coordinate the actions of Sons of Liberty members in multiple states, they should concentrate on a large group planning to attend the National Democratic Convention in Chicago at the end of August.
Hines and I were obliged to conclude that a vast number collected in one community offered our only hope. We knew that a large number, at least 50,000 men who were members of the Sons of Liberty, should be gathered at the National Democratic Convention. We advised Commissioner Thompson to accept the expressed opinions of the Sons of Liberty officials, who favored the convention as the occasion for armed hostility to the continuance of a war waged by the sacrifice of the white man's life for the abolition of the black man's slavery.
As part of their preparation, secret communications had been passed to Confederate prisoners at Camp Douglas in Chicago and the prison at Rock Island, Illinois, telling them to be ready for the attacks. Hines and Castleman would lead a force of about 60 Confederate soldiers based in Canada, mostly other Kentuckians who had, like themselves, served under General John Hunt Morgan. They were particularly well equipped for this kind of clandestine warfare. Historian Patrick Lewis.
With these folks in Southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, they can pass. They have the same dialect. We got the same idioms. A lot of them are raised in the same types of churches with the same types of theology, right? So they can blend into Midwestern society incredibly easy, and import Confederate arms and money, and potentially launch some really explosive insurrectionary activities with the assistance of Confederate prisoners who are stationed in prison camps all along the Great Lakes.
But unfortunately for Hines and his men, there was embedded within their ranks a Union spy. It wasn't Felix Stidger this time, but someone else who was going to ruin their carefully laid plans for the liberation of their imprisoned comrades. His name was George W. Young, a Confederate officer from Kentucky who had served with distinction as part of Morgan's raiders, escaped from Camp Douglas a year before, and made his way to Canada. At a certain point, perhaps worried that Hines' plans were flawed, Young contacted the Union military commander in Detroit, seeking amnesty as an escaped prisoner. To prove his worthiness, he provided information about an upcoming operation that was planned to coincide with the Chicago Convention. The Detroit commander explained the situation in a message to a fellow Union officer.
I have caused inquiries to be made in Canada about Major Young, and understand that he does possess the confidence of the rebel agents, and that his statements are entitled to respect. He now informs me that he proceeded to Toronto, and that about 200 rebel refugees are assembled at that place, who are armed with revolvers and supplied with funds and transportation tickets to Chicago, and that already 150 have proceeded there. The general plan is to accomplish the release of the prisoners at Camp Douglas, and in doing so, they will be assisted by an armed organization at Chicago. After being released, the prisoners will be armed and being joined by the organization in Chicago, will be mounted and proceed to Camp Morton at Indianapolis, and there accomplish a similar object in releasing prisoners.
Armed with this intelligence from the Confederate informant, the Union officers communicated what they knew to the Camp Douglas commander, Colonel Benjamin Sweet. This wasn't the first time Sweet had heard of such plots, but initially he had either dismissed or overlooked them. For example, earlier that year, Army officers in Kentucky had questioned an escaped Camp Douglas prisoner who claimed that anti-war Democrats in Chicago had provided money and horses to escapees. He mentioned a man named Walsh, who lived nearby and whose daughter smuggled messages into the camp. However, Sweet took no action to investigate Walsh or his daughter. But this time, his superiors took the information from the Confederate informant seriously enough to send additional troops to protect Camp Douglas from attack, along with a battery of cannon. One of the key members of the Confederate forces in Chicago, serving under Captain Thomas Hines, was Lieutenant Bennett Young. He sent a report to Confederate Commissioner Clement Clay, explaining what happened next.
In accordance with your orders, I left Canada Friday morning for Chicago to engage with my company in the enterprise contemplated by yourself and Colonel Thompson for the release of the Camp Douglas prisoners. Upon reaching Chicago, we found that already a strong force had been put into place by the Union Army, and veteran regiments were still arriving. One regiment was placed within Camp Douglas with the Confederates, and 16 pieces of artillery were parked, ready to open fire upon those defenseless men in case an attack was made. It required no great amount of perception to see that an attempt to accomplish our object would result not only in their indiscriminate slaughter, but our own certain death under the circumstances. Captains Hines and Castleman decided to make no effort in that direction. We waited until Wednesday night, hoping something would turn up by which we could benefit our suffering comrades and enhance the glory of the Confederacy. It was then determined to make an attempt upon the prison at Rock Island, if the Copperheads would furnish a small portion of the long-promised aid. When brought to the test, they could not furnish 50 men for the purpose. Hines then admitted that the thing was a failure, and the men, with few exceptions, decided to return to Canada.
And so large numbers of federal troops show up in Chicago on the eve of the Democratic Convention.
Journalist and author Julian Schur.
There's a huge sweep of arrests. The Sons of Liberty, who are really braggarts rather than really brave men, basically show up to the planning meetings and say they're not going to do anything. The Confederates are outraged at the timidity of the Sons of Liberty. So the insurrection falls apart. So do any of the attacks on the prisons. And so the final ploy in this three-pronged attack, the prisons fail, the insurrection fails, is the political coup.
With the military operation in Chicago a bust, the Copperhead leaders moved ahead with Plan B, to take over the Democratic Party and install Clement Vallandigham as the party's nominee to face Abraham Lincoln in November's presidential election. But once the voting at the Democratic Convention began, it became clear that there wasn't enough support for Vallandigham. So, the convention turned to former Union General George McClellan, who supported the war, but disagreed with Lincoln on almost everything else. With the candidate chosen, the only avenue for the Copperheads to assert their power was in the party platform. And their goal was to make sure that platform promoted peace with the Confederacy at any cost.
The Copperheads were strong enough to where they adopted a peace platform.
Mark Lowes is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Cincinnati.
That is, the position that they took when Lincoln was running for re-election was they wanted a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. And of course, the only negotiated settlement you're going to get with the Confederacy is Southern independence. Of course, they nominated George B. McClellan as their candidate. And McClellan took the position that he was a unionist. He was not an abolitionist. He didn't like the emancipation policy. He was a white supremacist, but he stood by the Union. So you had, in 1864, the Democrats nominating a candidate who had exactly the opposite position as the platform he was running on. That was an achievement of the Sons of Liberty.
Vallandigham had failed to pull off a grand uprising during the convention, and not a single Confederate prisoner had been freed. On the political front, he had failed in his bid to become the presidential nominee, and he had achieved only a symbolic victory in forcing the party to accept a peace platform. But, as he retreated to his new home in Canada, he was still the supreme commander of the Sons of Liberty, with tens of thousands of members throughout the Midwest. And he was still allied with a well-funded team of Confederate guerrillas, who were ready to pivot once again to a new strategy.
A young steps out, fires a gun in the air, and says, "In the name of the Confederate States, I am taking over this town."
That's next time on the Copperhead Conspiracy. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Getteman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Juha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to Julian Schur, Patrick Lewis, and Mark Lowes, whose interviews were heard in this episode. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. That's copperheadconspiracy.org. And if you haven't already done so, please leave a review of this series on whatever platform you use to hear it. It will really help other listeners to find this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for another episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy.
Today's next story is part of Withstanding, a mini documentary series and exhibition featuring 6 adaptive reuse projects from across Ohio. Join us as we uncover stories of Ohioans' creativity and innovation. These sites, ranging from schools to warehouses to factories, reflect how our past has been shaped by the forces of industry, migration, education, and more. And their transformation shows how Ohioans are reimagining the future of our state's built heritage. If you asked anyone from Kings Mills, Ohio about the Peters Cartridge Factory, they would say it's creepy, or even haunted. And up until its renovation in 2021, no one would blame them. The factory, which produced ammunition and gunpowder, had grown dilapidated over the years, since its abandonment in 1968. The state of the building, plus the subject matter of weapons manufacturing, would rightly give people the creeps. But now, the building is home to some of the most sought-after apartments in the area. Here is that story.
It was considered one of the most haunted spots in Ohio. People were caught sneaking into the property from as far away as like Scotland. There was this sort of draw. At times, I had my own doubts that we could transform this to a place that people would want to live to.
What do you think now?
I am totally convinced that people want to live here.
If you grew up 30 miles north of Cincinnati, you probably knew about this abandoned site, a looming factory built in the early 1900s and left vacant for more than 50 years, tucked away in the woods alongside the Little Miami River. It was the stuff of legend.
So I played soccer for the high school. We would just run up and down that bike trail and look at the building.
My dad would take me to school every morning. We would come down by this building every day. And he had so many names for it. You know, like he had like the powder factory, or during Halloween, he would say like, ooh, there's the haunted factory.
Oh, it was definitely falling apart. Yeah, broken windows.
It's hard to adequately describe the mess that was here.
Check out this big tower. They call this the Shot Tower. You can't miss it when you look at the building, especially from an aerial view. But it wasn't there just for looks. Peters Cartridge Factory produced small arms ammunition primarily for shotguns.
Shot is the little pellets go into shotgun shells. They would hoist molten lead up to the top of that tower out there. They would pour the lead through the screen, and as the molten lead fell, centrifugal force would cause it to spin and form a perfect sphere.
What's that used now?
So the very top of it, nothing, but there are apartments up to here.
Wow. At the height of its powers during World War I, Peters Cartridge Factory was one of 6 companies producing the majority of small arms ammunition in the country. The company produced over 84 million rifle cartridges and 55 million pistol cartridges from this facility. The factory grew so prosperous that it, along with the King Powder Company, built the neighboring town of Kings Mills for its workers. That era obviously has ended, but the factory remains as a vestige of the past.
So it was a source of pride because of the history, but also kind of a source of angst because of the decaying nature. In 2012, it was declared by EPA as a Superfund site. And so the DuPont company, they were basically charged to have to clean up that site. It was then able to come to Blue Hill Shawn to get started on their redevelopment and adaptive reuse, and that started around 2017.
All right, so we're going to go in a unit here and meet one of the tenants.
Hi. Yeah, so I moved in February, beginning of 2021. Okay. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
Been here for a few years.
Look at these windows.
Yes, the windows are almost like their own piece of art.
There's sort of this assumption that these projects will be cheaper than a new construction project, and it's actually the opposite way. You're dealing with materials that are generally no longer manufactured, that you need to sort of find a like kind material to match, and that generally is not cheap. For this project, we had to go to a window company and say, we got these windows, they're like 10 feet tall and maybe 12 feet wide, and they need to look like they have there's separation, there's mullions in them, and yeah, can you do that? And some people are like, yeah, no, we can't.
So as part of the historic tax credits program, the renovation had to remain true to the factory's core qualities, including its narrow plan, its masonry, and its wide window bays. The total cost of renovation was budgeted at more than $25 million, and there's still more to do.
So this was the original powerhouse for the whole factory. When we came in here, there was these massive boiler systems. One of them had collapsed into the floor, and I remember thinking, what are we doing? And as we walked through it, I realized how interesting and unique this was, and if we could pull it off, it was going to be a tremendous project.
So now it's almost kind of flipped. So where it was a place where people worked, now it's where people spend the other amount of their time, which is now a home.
Think of how much history, this building has seen. And now it's seeing a separate part of history, which is me, like living here, and talking to you.
A building doesn't have one life. It has many lives. And when you can go in and breathe a new life into a building, that's a tremendous accomplishment for the community, for the people that live in the community, and for the people that come to live in the community.
And who knows where it's going to be in 40 years or 60 years or 100 years. I hope it's still here. And if it is, that's just such a story to tell.
This story was adapted for audio from one of our documentaries. If you'd like to watch the video version of this piece, as well as the documentaries for the other 5 sites featured in this project, visit midstory.org/with-standing, or our exhibit, which is currently on display at the main branch of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library. Withstanding is funded in part by the America 250 Ohio Commission and the Ohio Arts Council. This project is also supported in part by the Arts Commission and the City of Toledo and Lucas County. Hundreds of years ago, an estimated 60 million bison roamed the plains of North America. By the 1890s, they were almost extinct. Today, bison populations are growing thanks to extensive recovery efforts. One of those efforts is on a farm in Swanton, about 20 miles outside Toledo, where a small herd of bison graze. Just by living their lives, the bison are helping to restore the local ecosystem, bringing it back to the way it might have looked when bison were still the kings of the prairie. I had a chance to talk to Joshua Repp, one of our summer interns, about his reporting on this story. Here's that conversation now.
I wrote a feature piece about Bracy Gold Bison Ranch in Swanton, Ohio, which houses a herd of over 30 bison on a pasture of local plants. Before writing the article, I associated bison with the Great Plains states, and so I was surprised to find bison not too far away from where I grew up. The ranch became increasingly interesting to me as I dug into some of the history of bison in America.
What, of all reasons, inspired you to write this article?
Yeah, first, it was just the shock factor of finding a bison ranch so close to where I grew up, and just people don't really associate bison with places like Ohio. So it was that, but then also it was just a good example of a local sustainable action.
I think bison are cute. Do you think, are bison cute?
Bison are very cute. If you go to the website, you can see some of the images. I talked with Stacy Knopfzeiger, who started the ranch. She sent me a lot of photos. Bison are very cute, especially the baby bison.
Like, they're not cows, they're not domesticated, right?
Right. So they're native to North America. So that makes them a lot easier to farm. And then also they really contribute to the environment as well. So as they lay down or like they pad around, they kind of create depressions in the land, which create spaces for local birds and like local grasses.
So do we want to conserve bison? Like, why is that necessary?
Yeah, so it's pretty important nowadays. The thing is, bison were once the most prevalent hoofed animal on North America. This is prior to European colonization. They were estimated to be as high as 75 million. But the thing is, after colonization, settlers really valued their hides and their meat, and there was really just a huge market for them. So, especially in the 19th century, they were really aggressively farmed and killed. And so in 1872 alone, 2 million bison were killed just for their hides.
Wow.
And so people have speculated that the meat wasted during the 1870s alone could have fed more than 1 million people.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
a lot of waste.
Yeah. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 bison remained in the U.S.
Wow. So you went from 75 million to less than 1,000 in a period of less than a century.
Yes.
That's intense.
And in the article, I included a photo of a pile of bison skulls. And this pile is huge. I'm imagining it's 30 feet tall and really stretches back as far as I can see.
How are bison doing now?
Well, since the start of the 20th century, there have been a lot of efforts to help stabilize their population. So, as I mentioned earlier, they are managed by the Department of the Interior. So that manages about 11,000 bison through 19 herds on federal land. This ranch in Swanton, Ohio, isn't part of that, but it's just an additional part of how bison are being cultivated and how their species is surviving.
Yeah, it's great that now there's federal funding and initiative to actually bring the species back because it was kind of our fault.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So we have this farm. They're raising bison. But I think to raise bison, one might have to be eating the bison.
That's
so
right.
if bison were once so endangered, why are we eating them?
Stacey really emphasized this to me. She has a saying that to eat bison is to conserve bison. It might sound weird or something, but that's really true, and that's how the ranch survives.
Well, that's very exciting. I think it's great that we've done such great bison conservation that now we can eat them. Can you tell me a little more about the ranch? Anything interesting you found out?
Yeah, well, I think Stacey and Brent are very busy. I called Stacey and I managed to find a time when she was away from the farm. She mentioned that she doesn't get a lot of time to pick up calls. But she was telling me how, they really aim to bring the community into this as much as possible. So, they offer tours and they go around and show people around. And then there's an educational component to it as well.
So they have people coming in all the time. And part of their sustainability goals are selling the meat of the bison. Do they sell anything else?
They do sell some clothes made from bison wool.
So bison are obviously very important to the environment, and their rolling around and contributions to the ecosystem are obviously a necessary part of the sustainability aspect of the ranch. So has it been working? Have they seen any changes in the way that the environment has been operating?
Yeah, they have actually. But the thing is that bison are only one part of this. So the ranch also uses sustainable farming practices. So, for example, they use rotational grazing and they don't use herbicides on their fields. But combined with this bison effort, they have seen a lot of impacts. So they mentioned to me that they've seen a lot of local species return. On their website, it says that in one morning, they can hear 25 species of birds and they can see lots of butterflies coming to land.
So I guess having the bison there allows for more habitat for these birds and butterflies to exist. You mentioned something called rotational grazing. Can you tell me a little more about that?
As far as I know, I think it's just the bison kind of rotate what fields they graze on. So it gives the grass and other plants time to grow back. So it's not being overfarmed.
Oh, right. So that would be a good way to then promote more growth, which would then bring in the birds and the butterflies. Anything else you wanted to tell me?
This couple shared with me that it was their family dream to start this ranch. When they met and first got married, they lived in this region. And they decided that they wanted to get into the agricultural field. And they had some background in it, but the husband had an office job. And so he really quit that as a passion project to start this ranch, which I think is incredible.
Right. And didn't the husband say that he thought the bison would be less work than regular cattle?
Yeah. And I think it's true. Just because they're native to North America and bison haven't been domesticated for that long, they're very self-sustaining. So they can kind of survive on their own.
Self-sufficient.
Yes.
Oh. Well, thank you so much, Josh.
Mark your calendars for Saturday, April 11th for the largest regional pickleball tournament held at the University of Toledo, the Toledo Pickleball Classic and Career Futures Expo. The event is free and open to the public and will feature tournaments across corporate teams, UToledo student orgs, and local high schoolers, a career futures expo with 80-plus companies looking for their next round of talent, and a community carnival with bouncy houses, a free kids pickleball clinic, food trucks, and more. Visit ToledoPickleballClassic.org for more info.
Founded in the 1970s, the Book Loft in Columbus, Ohio is no ordinary bookstore. Featuring a whopping 32 rooms of books, all discounted, the Book Loft is easy to get lost in. Just ask Eva Frazier, who grew up going to the Book Loft and wrote a piece on the bookstore as part of our winter internship this year. According to her, writers and readers alike agree that the Book Loft is more than just a store. It builds community among writers, contributing to the city's strong literary scene. In a conversation with Celia Johnson, Eva Frazier discusses the past, present, and future of this one-of-a-kind place.
So, what is the Book Loft?
The Book Loft is a 32-room bookstore in Columbus, Ohio. It's very historic. It's made up of 2 buildings that were built in the late 1800s. So the rooms are very winding and very full of books, which I like.
And what got you interested in writing about the Book Loft?
Well, I grew up going to the Book Loft, and I just think it's such a unique place in Columbus. And independent bookstores are on the rise, and I wanted to feature my favorite independent bookstore.
Great. Well, you said it's a very historical building. I know it's sort of stretched across 2 buildings. Is that right? So, I mean, how did that unusual arrangement come to be? I mean, what was in that building before the Book Loft was there?
So before the Book Loft was there were about like a billion different businesses. So I said previously they were built in the late 1800s, both the buildings. And they both started off as like saloons, grocery stores. They were generally like that in the beginning. And then one of the buildings was a movie theater, and then a toy store, a toy factory, a doll hospital, and then an indoor golf school, an art colony, which several like well-known artists practiced at, and then a mini mall, which is where the Book Loft started.
That's a pretty unique history. I mean, indoor golf school, doll hospital. Those are not things you see everywhere. And whenabouts was the Book Loft founded?
The Book Loft was founded in 1977. It took up like a couple rooms in the mini mall, which was called the Marienplatz, which was owned by Marnie Southard and her husband. But its original iteration was in a different location. And I don't know exactly when it was founded, probably the early to mid 70s, but that was in like an old streetcar barn that was also turned into a mini mall. So I don't know what was going on with mini malls at the time in German Village and Columbus, but something, it was like the heyday or something. But it started there. And then eventually moved on to its current location.
So it's been its current location for 40 plus years, is that right?
Yes, and in 2027, it's going to be their 50th anniversary.
Oh, that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Well, you spoke about one way the Book Loft has changed, right? It's gotten a lot bigger. It's started to occupy more rooms in the building. What are some other ways that, it's changed or maybe stayed the same since being founded?
So I feel like one of the things that stayed the same is its dedication to its customers, its business model. The business model definitely hasn't changed. It's a bunch of bargain books, but they're all new and they're discounted at various prices. So that has been a constant. Also, their dedication to their authors, whether it be local or national, has been, I think, like a constant focus for them. But something that has changed, other than the amount of rooms they have acquired, is the owners, Carl Jacobsma and Roger Tompkins, and then also Russ Eiler. Well, Russ Eiler and Carl Jacobsma officially bought the building that the Book Loft takes up in 2021 with help of a Columbus investor, Jared Jablonka. And it's really neat because Jared Jablonka was a longtime customer of the Book Loft. And so you can kind of see that its impact on its customers, really lasting throughout time and benefiting it.
Yeah, it's nice to see one of the customers was able to help the Book Loft with its future. Well, let's talk a little bit more about community. So how does the Book Loft fit into a wider, you talked about it's in German Village, it's in Columbus, it supports readers and then authors. So, how do all those things play a role in this wider community?
The community that the Book Loft creates is really unique. They host events with local authors, and they even host events outside of the Book Loft. And they partner with other local businesses like cat singers and tap rooms and all kinds of different things. They also do things for local book festivals. They're the official bookseller for the Ohio Book Festival, which its sole purpose is to promote Ohio authors. And then they're also a bookseller for the Columbus Book Festival, which is local and national. So they're involved with book festivals, they're involved with local businesses. And I talked to several local authors who basically sung the praises of the Book Loft, and that they really do care about the authors. Like if an author comes in, they'll recognize them, ask how they're doing, ask about what they're writing, all kinds of different things. So I feel like that is a part of the community that the Book Loft creates. And it's also, a part of the amazing network of independent bookstores in Columbus, where basically you can go to like reading, a book signing, like almost every night between all the bookstores. So I think that's really cool and unique about Columbus.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. How did you find these authors to interview? Did they just, did you just contact a wide number of authors and see if they want to talk about the Book Loft, or are there some, familiar names who are always there?
I did kind of just reach out and see who would answer. Yeah, it was kind of just me looking at the authors that, the Book Loft sell, like the books that they sell, and then reaching out and hoping someone would answer. And the authors were very generous and really, really sweet. So that was awesome.
I think that's super unique, right? Bookstores sell so many authors. So for an author to feel that connection to one particular bookstore. Well, you mentioned that, you went to the Book Loft as a child. You grew up in Columbus, is that right?
Yes.
So, how do you see yourself fitting into this community? What was it like to visit the Book Loft as a kid, and what's it like now?
As a kid, honestly, I was afraid I was going to get lost in there forever. It's amazing, but as a small child, kind of short, these tall book stacks all around you, hallways filled with books, like little nooks and crannies. Sometimes I'm like, I'm going to get stuck in here. But as a kid, I would always go down to the basement, to the kids section, and kind of hole up in a little corner with a book until my parents eventually found me. I did not get lost. I'm still here today. And now I'm taller. I'm just kidding. It's amazing. I feel like honestly, I really like to go at kind of off times because it can get a little bit crowded. And those hallways are pretty narrow. And if you want to really kind of look at books and maybe read one for a little bit, I would recommend going maybe on a weekday or something. But I really like to go get a coffee, browse, get so many books that I don't need, but it just feels good to support a local business and a place that I've been coming to for so long.
Well, we appreciate you sharing the story of the Book Loft with us, even if it means it might get a little bit more crowded and harder for you to fit through the hallways. You talked a little bit about, the context of this bookstore within the rise of independent bookstores around the country. So, what were your interviewees saying to you about that?
Most of my interviewees were really excited about the rise in independent bookstores. One author, Andrew Welsh-Huggins, specifically talked about the new bookstores in Columbus that were opening. It's just amazing. I feel like people are excited, especially, I don't know, like there are a lot of things that are tough right now, and stories and the growth of and sharing of stories is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Eva. What's one thing we didn't cover that you want listeners to know before we end this segment?
I kind of want to highlight one little part of the building's history that I didn't get to emphasize as much. So that toy store doll hospital thing, it was basically the toy store was started maybe in the early 1900s / like 1920s, and that was owned by a husband and wife, mostly run by the husband, John Keller. But then when he passed away, the wife, Elizabeth Keller, started the doll hospital. And she also kind of had a toy factory where she employed women. And I just think that's really cool. It was like the 20s and 30s. So that's, not super common at that time. And I don't know, I just feel like the site of the Book Loft, it's been a lot of things, but it's also been a pioneer of a lot of things. And I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, that's a really great story. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Midstory Hour. We have a full lineup for our next episode, so tune in next Saturday at 10 a.m. to hear more about Midstory, our home, and our greater region. If you have a story you'd like to share or would just like to drop us a note, please contact us at contact@midstory.org. We'd love to hear from you. The Midstory Hour is a Midstory podcast produced in collaboration with WGTE. It features original work produced by our dedicated team of reporters, researchers, data analysts, and creators. This episode was hosted and written by Yafa Siegel and edited by Evan Blanco. Artwork is by Ruth Chang and Joshua Rep. This week's episode featured stories by the greater Midstory team, including Yafa Siegel, Celia Johnson, Joshua Rep, and Eva Frazier. Midstory is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to progressing the Midwest narrative through media storytelling, solutions-oriented research, and community programming. Founded in 2018 by 4 individuals who found their way home from the East Coast to Toledo, Ohio, Midstory re-envisions the Midwest story toward a productive, bright, and influential future. Learn more at www.midstory.org.